you also to Ashley, both for being with us today and for providing us a closure, as you'll hear shortly about her life. So I'm going to go through a brief review of Yda Addis's earlier life, meaning from her birth in 1857 until she was freed after being jailed for a criminal libel conviction in 1901. And for many years, until very recently, that was all people knew about the life of this extraordinary woman, that she seemed to have vanished as the 20th century was dawning. But as Ashley will tell us about later, there is much more to the story than that. And so we're very happy to be able to present that to people today. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the background of this very interesting figure. Yda Addis was born in what was known as Bleeding, Kansas, just before the Civil War, an area of the United States on the borderlands in the far west. A lot of disputes about how far slavery should spread as new states are being admitted to the Union. She was born to Sarah Short and Alfred Addis, and on the bottom left is a marriage notice for the two of them. This is Lawrence, Kansas, now a college town on the eastern part of the state. And Alfred was a tailor by at least one thing that he did in his early life, but by 1860, the census in the bottom right here, he has called himself an artist. And by that, we're talking about photography, because it's a trade that he actually learned from his father-in-law. And so that's a little bit of the setup here. So there's Alfred on the bottom left. As you can see, the advertisement on the top right from Lawrence, Kansas in 1855 when he's a tailor, and then he becomes a photographer. Also operated a theater in the early 1860s, so had a lot of different things going on. He was a wanderer in many ways, physically, in terms of his jobs, wandered in his marriages and family life as well. In fact, he did have at least a second marriage. So he had Sarah Short and his children. There was Yda and other kids, and then he left them and wound up in Cincinnati, where he married, just after the Civil War was over, a woman out there in the River City. And after a few years, abandoned her, so she had to file for divorce. You can see that here on the left is the second marriage date and the date of the abandonment for divorce proceedings and all of that. And eventually he winds up reuniting with Sarah Short and his kids from that first marriage, and spends quite a number of years down in Mexico, in the northeastern state of Chihuahua, not too far south of Texas and New Mexico. And so there's some years spent in that part of Mexico, and then the family probably migrated west across that country to the coast, and then made their way up to Los Angeles. How or why is not exactly known. I mean, how, I guess we know that, but coming by ship. Why exactly Los Angeles is not at this point clear. But Alfred Addis did wind up opening a photo studio in Los Angeles, actually traveled through California taking pictures. And we're now into the early to mid 1870s, by which time Yda is old enough to attend the newly opened Los Angeles High School. She is one of the early graduates there. But even before she finished school, she was starting to publish poems, be part of literary societies and what have you. And once she concludes her education at LA High School in 1875 with that first graduating class of only, I think, 7 students, she winds up getting her teaching certificate. It did not involve the kind of long process of credentialing that we have today, but she did get her certificate, and she went down to teach school in a new town called Tustin in what is now Orange County, returned to Los Angeles, and did that for several years, about the time you get to the 1880s. Now, meanwhile, the family again migrated quite a bit. Alfred again wandered away from his wife and family from Los Angeles, wound up back in Mexico for a period. There was another period of reunification. Yda spends quite some time in the middle 1880s back in Chihuahua, where the family had been before. And so she sometimes wrote back to Los Angeles newspapers to let them know what she was doing down there, including research on Mexican natives, indigenous people, their work with pottery, iridescent pottery in particular, did other writing during this course of the 1880s. And so she was starting to get some attention on the West Coast of the United States because she was publishing in larger journals like newspapers in San Francisco and what have you. So getting a bit of a reputation as a literary figure, which for women at this time, as you can imagine, was pretty rare. There were others during that time. I first heard about Yda because of research I did on crime and criminal justice from the 1850s to the mid 1870s. There had been a young teenage woman in Los Angeles in the 50s named Ina Coolbrith, who published poems in the local Los Angeles newspapers and wound up in San Francisco. And it's almost like Yda's the next generation from Ina Coolbrith. So there were some people, some women who were able to try to pursue a career in writing, but it's a tough profession for anybody, much less women. And so Yda was able to achieve some things in that regard. She also, however, wound up meeting John G. Downey, who was a former governor of California, a major figure in Los Angeles. He was a banker, had a lot of real estate activities, the founder of his namesake city, southeast of Los Angeles. Downey lost his wife in a terrible train crash. There was a series of cars that got cut loose on an incline from the rest of the train, and uncontrolled, these cars went down a hill and left the track. Downey was able to survive, but his wife died in that incident. And so not too long after that, he met Yda. And it's one of these he said, she said versions. And sometimes the he said gets more attention for obvious reasons. I think about, gender, position, and power. Also, Downey was a prominent figure. Yda was a young woman. And so the gist of this is that she later claimed that he had promised to marry her. And she was considering filing a breach of promise suit, sometimes known as a heart balm suit. And it got pretty nasty in terms of some of the media coverage. Downey wound up being portrayed. Yda claimed a lot of what was being said in her name was not really from her, that he was a drunkard and he was susceptible to influence by friends and family who were very much against her and all of that. It wound up being a very interesting and controversial situation here in Los Angeles in the middle 1880s. The first of several incidents in which Yda had issues with powerful men in her life. It wound up that there was no suit pursued after a while. Downey married quite quickly a housekeeper in his household. And so Yda wound up moving on to other things. As I mentioned, when she was in Mexico, she was pursuing research on the indigenous people down there and their artwork with iridescent pottery. And a lot of this wound up being published in a very renowned magazine called Harper's. And one of the editors was a guy named Charles Dudley Warner, who actually wrote extensively about California and many other things. And so again, this is a male in position of power, and he evidently told her he was going to publish her work strictly under her name. It wound up being manipulated so that she did not get the full credit that she believed she was entitled to. Warner, of course, claimed otherwise and said he was fully transparent with her. But another brouhaha erupts with Yda and a powerful man. And she is defending herself vigorously in publication. There was defense of her in Los Angeles newspapers and what have you. It's just another example of where she runs into conflict with powerful male figures. In 1890, shortly after the Harper's fracas took place, she winds up being hired to write the county history for Santa Barbara and Ventura. And there were a series of these published for California counties at this time. It was an era of big interest in American history through things like this. I don't know how many women were hired to do these, probably, again, pretty rare. And in the course of doing her work, she winds up meeting Charles Stork, who was a longtime resident of Santa Barbara, actually very briefly published a newspaper in Los Angeles called the Herald, got into financial trouble. And one of his early publications, maybe the first issue of the Herald, he talked about meeting a young woman who wanted to submit writings to him. And I wondered if that was Yda. He didn't identify the person. But in any case, she interviews him. They quickly fall in love and marry very early on in their relationship here in 1890. Stork had a young son named Thomas. And so within just several months, the marriage crumbles, melts down very quickly. And it's interesting that in a newspaper article just before they, just after the couple got married, there was a Redlands newspaper, Redlands being a city east of Los Angeles, that said, as you can see here, that they would bet a cookie that Mrs. Yda could no more be kept quiet at home than could Miss Yda. So whether there was already some foreknowledge of her own sense of, of self-worth and what she would be willing to do or not do in the course of a marriage, as opposed to being a literary figure, is interesting to contemplate. At the bottom left, as the marriage starts to turn into a divorce, you can see two storks being chained together. So commentary by our cartoonist about this. On the right, just a little brief statement where Stork started to tell people that he believed that Yda was insane. He, as a young man, he was still a teenager when he fought in the Civil War, had been captured and kept in some of the notorious Confederate prison camps. And so there's some question about that too, because she also said that he had his own insanity. And then there's young son Tom, who apparently battled with his mother-in-law, whether it was mostly his fault, mostly her fault, or both. Of course, is one of those issues that we probably cannot solve. But I won't go into a lot of detail other than to say that the divorce issue lasted for years. Stork resisted paying alimony, as he was told to do by the courts, and Yda was not going to give up. That was definitely her nature, was to fight for herself whenever possible. Some weird things came up during this time. There were rumors being brought about that she had gone to Mexico and had an affair with a newspaper editor. She later claimed, as an article here on the left says, that actually that was not her. That was a sister she did not know about, who somehow wound up going from Chicago, from a life of shame, to Mexico City and taking up with the same editor that she was accused, Yda, of being involved with. A very strange story. It seems pretty obvious that even though she did have a half-sister named Maud, who died early in the 1890s and could not defend herself, when these articles were being written and these statements were being made, that it was not Maud who was in Mexico City during that time, it was actually Yda. And again, just lots of weird things happening to Yda Addis during the 1890s. It was just not the divorce. She was also charged with stealing a letter that was intended for her son, who at this point was in his early 20s. There was only $1 in the letter, apparently, but it was enough to build up a charge of petty larceny. It wound up becoming a perjury charge because she evidently lied about what she had done with this letter. It was clearly much more personal than legal. It did not wind up going anywhere as far as that goes. But there were other lawsuits she was involved in, compensation about work that she did as a journalist, that she had left goods with a friend of hers and didn't get them back while she was down in Mexico, and she sued that person. So Yda was in a whole host of legal trouble during the 1890s. The worst part of it was that when she accused some people in Santa Barbara of somehow being involved in a murder, and it got to the point where she was actually convicted of writing poison pen letters, libelous letters, as part of this, that there was some kind of blackmail or revenge going on with this. Very controversial trial in Santa Barbara. And again, I'm just skating over this, but it wound up putting her in a position of being convicted and sentenced to 1 year in county jail in Santa Barbara. A lot was said about her appearance, about her demeanor, questions about her mental health, and all of that. Her lawyer during some of these legal issues was a guy named Grant Jackson, who wound up practicing in Los Angeles later on. And during the course of her trials and travails, Yda claimed that she was married, kind of common law, not in an official way, church marriage or civil marriage. And she started to take her name during this time. So as you look at the far right here, it says Yda Addis Stork Jackson. Not only did she take his name, but she was actually on trial for attempting to murder him. She had showed up at his house, climbed in through his bedroom window, and apparently had some materials with him to basically knock him out and all of that. She claimed it was a total mistake, that she just wanted to speak to him, that she was desperate because of her legal issues and the personal issues she had with him, and she had no intention of hurting him. Very strange set of circumstances. I just briefly want to mention that she did hire an attorney who was a famous female member of the judiciary, Clara Shortridge Foltz, who became quite well known in Los Angeles later on. What wound up happening finally, as we get to the very early part of the 20th century, is that Yda, on her own initiative, she files an appeal and she presents information about this. And even though there was a time when there was an affirmation of the verdict of criminal libel, she did wind up eventually getting the Supreme Court of California to rule that she should have a new trial. And that new trial never happened. Yda was freed in 1901. And then that's where we thought for a long time that was the end of the story, and that she just vanished into the mist of history. And so this is now where I'm going to turn things over to Ashley. I do want to tell you a little bit about her before she starts her presentation. I did a full presentation on Yda in 2020. Ashley watched it and then got a hold of me afterwards to say that she thought she had found out what had happened to Yda after 1901. And so that's why, of course, we're here today. So let me give you a little background about Ashley. She is a history major from Carleton College in Minnesota. She earned her law degree from the University of Virginia and is a practicing attorney. But Ashley is also an avid genealogist who believes that researching the lives of ordinary people is a great way to learn history, which falls right in line with what we try and do at the Homestead Museum. She now lives and practices law in the great city of Baltimore, Maryland. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ashley. And again, thank you all very much.
Thanks, Paul, and hello, everybody. I am so delighted to be here. This has been a really fascinating project for me to work on, and I am very grateful to Paul and Jenny and the Homestead Museum for sharing their platform with me. So I will jump right in. I am going to start by saying that I had never heard of Yda Addis until a few years ago, and she was not initially the focus of my research. I was doing something else entirely, namely, hang on. There we go. Okay. So I was working on a genealogy project, and this is a part of my family tree. And this guy up here in the upper left is kind of my white whale, Jacob Short, who was an immigrant from a German-speaking area, possibly in France. And it's always been something I've always wanted to get him back over the pond. But he first appears in records in Kentucky as a 23, 24-year-old in the early 1790s. He marries there Elizabeth Freeman, and they have a number of kids. And I'm going to stop and say, you're probably thinking this has nothing to do with Yda Addis. I will get there. So one thing that one of my uncles told me years ago when I started doing this sort of research is one of the best ways to get information on a person is to research the people around them. So I have been interested in Jacob's kids for their own sake, but also because you never know when you might find some piece of information that might lead you back another generation. So Jacob and Elizabeth had a number of children, and I had pretty good information on most of them. This guy Joseph is my direct ancestor. The family stayed in Kentucky for about 20 years, but migrated to southern Indiana, Jefferson County, right across the river from Kentucky, in about 1810. And you'll see here, most of these kids stayed in Indiana. But this guy, Jefferson Short, has always been a bit of a mystery. We really didn't know anything about him. He was mentioned in a sibling's will. There's a letter from a nephew that says he married a woman named Hillis, might have lived in Mississippi, ended up in San Francisco, but that nephew didn't know anything else anymore. I should say that that nephew had also probably never met him, or if he did, it was as a small child, so that information was always suspect. So I had tried off and on for years to track down Jefferson without success. And so a couple years ago, I decided to kind of change tactics. And I started looking for Jefferson shorts just to see if I could connect any of them back to this family living in southern Indiana. So early on, I came across some information on this fellow, Thomas Jefferson Short of Lexington, Missouri. The first thing I found was this letter here on the left, which is really interesting. So in 1850, Jefferson Short and Napoleon Draper Short, who was his son, were a part of a gold hunting expedition that left from Lexington, headed to California. And this was a letter that one in the group was carrying with him that basically said, hey, if any of us die, please contact this lawyer back in Lexington who will see to our affairs. So that was kind of fun. And then I found Jefferson in the 1850 census in Lexington, Missouri, with his family. And what was really interesting about this to me, and the reason I kept looking at this particular family, was that you noticed that a number of the older kids were born in Indiana. So that made me think, this could be my guy. And then when we got to the next census in 1860, this is Jefferson up here, Thomas Jefferson Short up here. And these are actually two families that are enumerated. So you've got Jefferson, his wife, the two older kids, and then this down here is the household of Yda Addis's parents, Alfred Addis and Sarah Short, who married Alfred. This is the first mention of Yda right here. But also living with the Addises were some of Sarah's siblings. And this is what popped out to me, the name Hillis. Because of that letter that I had from Jefferson Short's nephew that said he thought that his uncle had married a woman named Hillis. So I kept getting these little clues. Okay, maybe this is the family. So I ended up becoming very familiar with this family because, again, I was thinking, okay, well, maybe there's something about Thomas Jefferson Short's children or grandchildren that will tell me if this is my guy, if this is my Jefferson Short from Indiana. So I'm going to go through this in a little bit of detail because what's on this this slide is really critical to how I ended up finding out more information about what happened to Yda Addis. So starting right here, you've got Thomas Jefferson Short's wife, Lucinda Hillis, who her family, quite like Jefferson Short's family, started out in Kentucky, but moved to southern Indiana when she was quite young. She was most likely the daughter of James Hillis and a woman named Mary Herod. Remember that name. And also, you know, as we go through this, you'll note that the name Hillis is showing up over and over and over again. It was very clearly an important family name for this group of people. Thomas Jefferson Short and Lucinda had 7 children who survived to adulthood. And almost all of them ended up on the West Coast. There was one who was in Oregon, the rest were in California. One of them here stayed in Kansas. And interestingly, just as a side note, both these guys, Harvey Newton Short and Napoleon Draper Short, were both in the newspaper business, as was ultimately their niece, Yda Addis. So you've got Sarah Short here, Ida's mother. Her middle name was Hillis. She was married, as Paul said, to Alfred Shea Addis, who was from Pennsylvania initially. One of the other important figures I want to point out here is Mary Hillis Short, Sarah's sister, who also went by Molly. She actually played a small role in one of the divorce trials, one of Yda Addis's divorce trials from Charles Stork. She apparently had lived with them for a short period of time and was called to testify about some incidents that she had witnessed. She actually did not come to court to testify. She gave her testimony at the American consulate in Chihuahua. So it appears that both Sarah and Mary, after Alfred Addis died in 1886, had gone back to Mexico. The other important figure here is Ida's brother, whose name was Judge Addis, but he spent most of his life in Mexico and went by Carlos. He died in 1908 in Mexico. And one thing to notice here from the Yda Addis's perspective, if you're Yda Addis in 1901, who is your family? All of her uncles, except for Harvey Newton Short, had died by that point. He was alive and living in Orange County. Her father was gone. These uncles were gone. We don't really know what was going on with Sarah and Mary at that point because I hadn't been able to find any record of their death, but the assumption is either they had died or they were in Mexico. And then Carlos down here was in Mexico. So she didn't, Ida would not have had that many places to go. I mean, she's got the uncle in California and the rest of her family was probably in Mexico at that point. So it would make sense for her to have gone there. But I was not researching Yda Addis. In the course of researching the family, I learned about her and I read, all these fascinating newspaper articles about her, and I got very familiar with her story. And even though she was a ton of fun to research, she wasn't really my focus. So this is a project I put aside for a couple of years, and I came back to it last winter. And I plugged Thomas Jefferson Short into Family Search, which is the LDS Church's website. And I don't remember the exact search, but the results looked something like this. And they really caught my eye for a couple of reasons. So obviously I got Thomas Jefferson Short in the results. That's what I searched for. But look over here. The spouse is Lucinda Herod. Well, that's close to what I was looking for. His spouse's name was Lucinda Hillis, but her mother was named Herod. So, that made me wonder a little bit. And then he had two children, Mary H. Short, as did the Thomas Jefferson Short I'm looking at. And then look down here, another daughter named Sarah S. Hillis. Okay, well, he didn't have a daughter named Sarah Hillis. He had a daughter named Sarah Hillis Short who married an Addis. But still, I wanted to look at these two records and just kind of see what was going on. The other thing to notice here is that these were Texas death records. And Texas is not a state that I had found associated with this particular family. So first up, I looked at Sarah Hillis's death certificate, excuse me. Sarah died in Laredo, Texas in 1913. She was 63 years old, I believe, which would have made her about a decade younger than the Sarah Short that I was looking for. But again, says she was born in Kentucky. Okay, well, my Sarah was born in Indiana, so. But again, you have this information about her parents, which just looks so close to what I was actually looking for. The other thing to notice here is that the death certificate, the information on the death certificate was provided by somebody called A. Hillis Jackson. So then I pulled Mary's death certificate. She also died in Laredo, Texas in 1913. And the information on her death certificate is pretty much the same as what we saw on Sarah's. But the thing that jumped out with hers is this. Look at this. This is a portion of the death certificate that says or indicates where the person lived before. And it said that Mary had lived in Chihuahua, Mexico. So I wanted to know a little bit more about these two women. So I went looking for death notices, and I found one for Mary. And this is in I believe a paper, yes, a paper in Laredo. And there's this little bit at the bottom. It says Mrs. Short's sister died here in July. These ladies were great-granddaughters of Colonel James Harrod, historic pioneer and legislator of Kentucky who founded Harrodsburg, Kentucky. Well, I had remembered when I was reading about Yda Addis that there had been this article where she was talking about her own family history, which of course was what I was interested in. So that's why it really stood out to me. And you see that here on the right, where Yda Addis said the exact same thing about her Harrod lineage, which, by the way, is probably untrue. She was almost certainly not a descendant of this James Harrod, but that's another point. The point here is that both A.H. Jackson, who was presumably the source for this information in the Laredo article, and Yda Addis were telling the same story about their aunt and mother's family history. So who was A.H. Jackson? Quite conveniently, her death certificate was also available online. And there are a number of things to note here. So she's identified as Mrs. A.H. Jackson. She died in June of 1941. She's listed as divorced. Her age, they say 60 with a question mark. So that would put her birth around 1880. Yda Addis was born in 1857, so that's a pretty big difference. Her mother is identified as Yda Hillis. So we now know, if this group of three women, Mary, Sarah, and Mrs. A.H. Jackson. Mrs. A.H. Jackson is the daughter of Sarah. And then there is this. The father is identified as Alfred Shea Emmett of Pennsylvania. This is from the death certificate. This is a little portion of one of the articles that Paul showed earlier, which it's a part of a letter that Yda Addis wrote when her father died. And she identifies him as a native of Pennsylvania, a connection of the Irish Emmets. So, his name was Alfred Shea Addis. Here he's identified as Alfred Shea Emmett. But again, that was connected to something that Yda Addis had said about her family. So, who was this Mrs. A.H. Jackson? To my knowledge, Sarah Short and Alfred Addis had only one daughter, and that was Yda Addis. And maybe I should have caught on by then, but I was thinking, well, this woman's much younger. Maybe they had another daughter. So I start looking for information on A.H. Jackson. She first appears in 1910 in San Antonio in the city directory. And she's identified as a secretary to Edward Chamberlain, who was a banker. That same year, she and her Aunt Mary are shown in the census in San Antonio. and she is identified as a writer in the newspaper business. In 1920, she is also in San Antonio. In this time, her profession is listed as foreign correspondent. So this is when it kind of clicked for me. Is like, okay, well, maybe this is Yda. And then I found press reports of Mrs. A.H. Jackson getting a job with the Board of Trade in Laredo, Texas in 1912. And there are a couple of articles about this. This is one of them. And it says that she was formerly engaged in writing articles for magazines, but is now doing commercial work. And then it later mentions that she is proficient in Spanish. You know, and that's describing Yda Addis pretty well. So at this point, I was feeling pretty confident that despite the age discrepancy, this very well could be her. I want to point out a couple things about the names we're dealing with here, and Paul touched on this a little bit. The full name of Mrs. A.H. Jackson of Texas was Yda Hillis Jackson. Yda Addis's name at birth was Yda Hillis Addis. She married Charles Stork, and then, as Paul showed, at the time of her death, at the time of her disappearance, she claimed to be married to Grant Jackson, and in press reports at the time was referred to as Mrs. Jackson. So here we have the same middle name, her claimed last name, and then a variation on Yda down to the very unusual spelling of this name. So at this point, I'm still looking for everything I can find on A.H. Jackson, and I was really surprised to come across this article from 1909. So it was about when she was in San Antonio, and it very specifically mentions her by name. So it says, in the late 80s, a young American girl, Mrs. A.H. Jackson, sojourning in Mexico, spoke to other visiting writers and artists of the great beauty of some plaques of iridescent ware she had found. This is a very, very clear reference to the article in Harper's that ended up being so controversial for Yda Addis. So for all of these reasons, I became quite comfortable that Yda Addis became Mrs. A.H. Jackson and essentially entirely rebuilt her life in Texas. But what do we actually know about that life in Texas? The truth of the matter is not very much. There's spotty bits of information, but there are a lot of kind of dead periods where we really don't know very much. So as I said, in 1910, she shows up in San Antonio. She's working as a secretary. Her Aunt Mary is living with her. At some point, her mother comes to live with her as well in San Antonio. And there are a couple of basically letters to the editor that she wrote during that time. This is one of them. And it's really interesting. She's responding to a previous article in the paper about ballads. And she writes in with the lyrics to a ballad called Nellie Gray, which was an abolitionist song written in the 1850s. She also refers in this letter to a large city where she lived. She doesn't identify it. And you know, some of the other songs she remembers from her childhood. The other kind of well-documented period of her life is her time in Laredo. So she got this job in Laredo in the fall of 1912. And while she was in Laredo, she appears to have been very civically active. She, in addition to her job at the Laredo Board of Trade, she volunteered. She was on the executive committee for the Washington birthday celebration that year. She spoke at a local club. And then one of her final acts in that job was that she apparently spearheaded the Board of Trade's participation in a national mock trial contest. And their entry won a prize for that. And then a week later, she resigned. It was reported in the local paper. There was no reason given. She apparently stayed in Laredo for at least a number of months. There's this is an excerpt from an article, I think from June maybe of that year, refers to Mrs. A.H. Jackson of Dallas, which I'm thinking is probably just an error, but again, identified as a well-known newspaper and magazine writer. Headquarters are presently at Laredo. She was working as a field agent for the Texas Industrial Congress, which was a new organization designed to attract business to Texas. And then, of course, we know that she was in Laredo later in 1913 when her mother and her aunt died. So after that, there's really not a whole lot of information about Mrs. A.H. Jackson. She donated some shafts and arrows from Mexico to a group in San Antonio in 1915. As we saw in 1920, she was shown in the census as a foreign correspondent. But keep in mind, in 1910, she was shown as, a writer for newspapers, and it was pretty clear at that time that she was not writing for newspapers. She was doing shorthand. She was a secretary. So, I kind of wonder how much of this was kind of aspirational. Like that's how she, she identified as a newspaper woman, as a foreign correspondent, but perhaps she wasn't actually working as one. And then in 1930, she is shown as a maid in a private residence. So it looks like, at least economically, things at that point were probably not going too well for her. Okay, you might recall that on A.H. Jackson's death certificate, it said that she died at the San Antonio State Hospital, which when I first saw it, I didn't really think much about because, people die at hospitals sometimes. But it turns out that the San Antonio State Hospital was the new name for the Southwestern Texas Insane Asylum. It had its name changed in the early 20th century. And sadly, that is where A.H. Jackson spent the last 11 years of her life. I have not found a record of the commitment proceeding, but there is the record of, there's a petition for temporary guardianship that was filed by a San Antonio attorney in December of 1930. And it references, excuse me, that she was committed to the San Antonio State Hospital based on the finding that she was suffering from paranoia. In this petition, this lawyer indicated that, or he estimated that her assets were $500, which is about $7,500 in 2021 terms. But he actually never accepted the guardianship. And there could be a couple of reasons for that, but I think the most likely is that she probably didn't even have $500. So it was not going to be worth this guy's time to be the guardian. And so that was at the end of 1930. She died in June of 1941, having spent that entire period at this hospital. So that is basically what I found. Brief summary is I'm pretty confident that A.H. Jackson was Yda Addis, but there's still a lot of questions. One is, okay, she disappeared in 1901. She shows up in San Antonio around 1910. Where was she in the meantime? You know, Mexico, I think, is a good possibility. I also found a woman in San Francisco. Her name was also Mrs. A.H. Jackson. She was also a stenographer. And even if it's not her, it's really cool. But basically, there's this article about the aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. And this Mrs. A.H. Jackson had volunteered at a camp where people were going for help. And I'll just read you a quote. It said that she was, quote, doing everything that had to be done, from writing the captain's letters to threatening to shoot a disorderly ruffian and turning him over to the guard. And in my mind, it kind of sounds like her, honestly, but I don't know that we'll ever know. So that's one question. Where was she for those 9 years? Another question, how did she support herself? We know she was a secretary for a while, then she had this job at the Board of Trade, worked for the Texas Industrial Congress, but I don't really know what happened to her, what she did for work after that. Third question is, how many people knew about her new identity? She appears to have gone to great lengths to excise the name Addis, to the point of removing it from her mother's death certificate, not identifying her mother's last name as Addis. And she certainly did not go by Yda, Y-D-A, which is a distinctive name. So it seems like she was probably trying not to be found. On the other hand, there is this article in 1909 that identifies her as Mrs. A.H. Jackson. So clearly some people knew. I would love to know what the circumstances were that led to her commitment. And then I'm also curious about what her experiences were when she was in the San Antonio State Hospital. That facility was overcrowded in the 1930s, and probably was not a very pleasant place to be. And then I think the big question is, how does the, quote unquote, diagnosis of paranoia inform what we know about some of the incidents that Paul talked about? Certainly when she was younger, she was portrayed sometimes as just being pure evil. And some of the actually more sympathetic articles suggested that she was very ill. And I think it's quite possible that she was suffering from mental health issues in her earlier life. But there's also a long history of people who don't fit the norm and people without resources being committed to asylums when perhaps they shouldn't have been. So it's hard to know. But in any event, it was a really tragic end to a remarkable life. It's also, there's also an irony there that, one of the rumors in 1901, or not in 1901, but one of the rumors that has existed presently is that she was committed in 1901 and maybe escaped, who knows. But, the reality is she did in fact end up in a hospital. So that is what I have. If anybody is interested, as I said at the beginning, my initial question was, I was trying to find Jefferson Short, the son of Jacob Short, brother of Joseph. were Joseph and Jefferson brothers? And the answer, I think, is yes. So that is all I have.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Paul. One of the questions that just came in a bit ago is from Heather. And she is the one that had written the two of you earlier about an 1888 painting signed by Y.H. Addis from Mexico, and wondered if there was any information that either of you have come across about her as an artist in addition to being a writer. And she also goes on to say that she had just found the painting yesterday in Kierville, about an hour from San Antonio. So she wonders if it helps to bolster the case of Yda being in Texas at some point.
Maybe. Well, first of all, that's incredibly exciting. That's very, very cool. Paul and I were talking about this earlier. I'm virtually positive that there are references in some of the newspaper articles to her drawing or painting or something, but we'd have to track them down. And who knows? I mean, how the painting got there, but yeah, sure. I mean, it sounds like it's not that far from San Antonio, so maybe it was something she had with her.
Yeah, it's just amazing to think she died in 1941, and who knows where her possessions were after 1930 even. And where did this painting go and how did it wind up where it is now? But yeah, I agree with Ashley. I think it's certainly very suggestive and definitely worth following up. So within seconds of logging off, I'll be poking around it. I'm sure Ashley probably will be too. See what we can find about the artistry.
Another question is somewhat a point of clarification. So did Ydas's husband, Charles Stork, have Yda held in a mental institution for a while? Is that where the theory of her going?
That's the rumor. That's what Ashley was referring to. It appears quite a bit, online that he had her committed, but I didn't see anything that showed that. So yeah, that's interesting thing. Just one thing I want to mention about this too, it's almost like there's these people who come together who have these issues. Like John Downey was grieving his wife. If he was a drinker, that could have had an effect on his mental health. Charles Stork, I wouldn't be surprised at all if he had PTSD from being, a prisoner of war in the Confederate camps as a teenager. And so there were accusations of insanity thrown back and forth. But no, I don't. Actually, maybe you saw something, but I didn't see anything directly saying that he had her committed.
No, I didn't either.
It's interesting to think where these theories, especially around in women's history, where these theories of often having, problematic women put away isn't unheard of. But it's interesting that became the assumption. So you wonder sometimes if these stories kind of merged together since she was later put in an institution, if that was a possibility.
Sure, and I think part of it again is that divorce saga between the two went on for pretty much the entire 1890s. And so there was a lot of publicity about that, and both sides accused each other of being insane. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if somebody just assumed or read into an article and thought that he had her committed.
Hedler also just popped in with another comment saying that there were also several other paintings unsigned of Mexican scenes and a framed indigenous Mexican textile in the same dealer's booth. So she wrote to the antique store to see if the dealer could give me more information about where the paintings and perhaps other related items came from. So it'll be interesting to see if there's more information that can be found out about Yda the artist. Joyce just made the comment that that Yda seemed to be intelligent and perhaps high strung. She had erratic behaviors, so she seemed to be a bit unstable at times.
Yeah, that was definitely mentioned in a number of articles about her. I mean, she clearly was, as Ashley said, she followed her own path and all that, did not fit the norm. Think of the Victorian era and what women were supposed to do and not do. She didn't follow a lot of that, but I agree with Ashley. It does seem suggestive that she had some form of mental illness. And of course, these things tend to get worse as you get older. So it would not surprise me that her commission could have been very well from paranoia. She did show what could be argued as paranoid tendencies, although I think Stork probably was very much the same in many ways.
Just going to take a look at Facebook. If anybody else has any questions or comments that they'd like to post, please feel free to do so now. Ashley, on Yda's death certificate, I noticed that it said, was hers some sort of ovarian cyst? It looked like her aunt possibly also died of some sort of ovarian cancer.
Yeah, her aunt, I believe, says ovarian cyst. I think Yda's was uterine cancer. And I believe the mother, it sounded awful. I think it said it was cancer of the face.
Oh my gosh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, and Yda and her aunt did not have children, apparently. So that's not uncommon for women who didn't have children to have uterine or ovarian cancer, that sort of thing too.
Sunny just made a comment. I guess paranoia caused a lot of troubles in her life. I watched the first part of Yda Addis, and now I can understand why she was like that. Thank you for giving us the second part. More, it's nice to have closure to her story, so thank you. All right. I'm gonna just let it stay open for another 30 seconds or so. If anybody has any other questions or comments that they would like to make. It is very nice, Sunny, I would have to agree that having closure, especially to women's stories in history, sometimes those stories just end up being lost to the ages. So being able to kind of button up someone's story is very nice to have an idea of at least what happened to them, even if it is an unpleasant ending. Thanks for this great presentation. As another comment, I'm curious where you see Yda's story intersecting with larger events or trends in American history.
Ashley, you want to try that one?
Go for it.
Well, I think the one that definitely stands out is just the role of women who are not conforming to expected ideas of what you're supposed to do, which basically, like, she finished high school. Okay, so then what would be the normal thing that she would do? Find a husband, maybe teach for a year or two, because a lot of young women did teach in their late teens, and then you're supposed to get married and have kids, and that's it. And she didn't do that. But there was a rising number of women who were challenging that, not just in the West Coast, but other parts of the country. So I think that's definitely part of it. I think the idea of just how we look at mental health is another thing to think about with her story, because hers is fairly public. A lot of women, as you were alluding to, Jenny, would get committed for things that we wouldn't dare to do now. I was just reading the other day that the psychiatric profession is now starting to debate, and some are recognizing that just grief itself could be a mental illness in a certain way. So I think those are two things that stand out for me, is the mental health aspect and also just the role of women.
I would definitely agree with that. Actually, that will be a later story in our female justice series on Christine Collins as well, and how sometimes the law also gets involved with this and kind of oversteps those boundaries. Another comment is just a thank you to you both for chasing down these clues and to give us some more info about Yda's life and what happened to her. So a couple of thank yous for putting together this program today. I'm not seeing any questions anywhere else, so I want to thank both Paul and Ashley for putting together this program and letting us know what happened to Yda. And also to please invite all of you watching to some of the other programs that we have coming up here at the Homestead Museum. Just going to share my screen really quickly here. So we have a few different programs coming up in the next few months. On April 1st, our nonfiction book club will be getting together. They're reading right now the story of silver, how the white metal shaped America as well as the modern world. They tend to meet on the first Fridays of every month from 10 a.m. to noon. And we're going to be coming back with kind of hybrid programs, meaning that some of these programs are still available online for those who still prefer to watch on Zoom or can't physically make it to the museum. But also, if you are interested in being back on at the Homestead Museum, these programs will be offered here in person as well at the same time. On April 16th, Paul will be back with another installment of the Workman and Temple family history, All That Glitters in the Gilded Age, the Workmen and Temples in 1890s Los Angeles, which will be a very interesting program as we kind of close out the ends of the Victorian era and what was going on with the Workman and Temple family. On May 15th, the Homestead Museum is having an open air art day, which now seems appropriate, having talked about Yda, and since she had artistic tendencies as well, quite possibly. If any of you do, please join us at the Homestead Museum. We'll be setting up areas for artists, photographers, painters of all types, to let the grounds of the homestead kind of act as your muse. So you're welcome to either come and paint yourselves or to watch others in their artistic processes and just enjoy the grounds for the day. Tours of both houses will be made available those days as well. And that will be on May 15th from 12 to 4 p.m. And then on May 22nd, we have another installment of Female Justice, Maud Coffitz, a very intriguing young woman who gets tied up in attempted murder, arson, and a cohort's pretty shocking suicide in early 20th century Los Angeles. So hopefully you will join us for one or more of these programs. Again, a huge thank you to Ashley and Paul for joining us today.